Good morning. I'm Bill Traynor, Dean of Georgetown Law, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for this discussion on preparing the next generation, activism, and healing. This is part of our ongoing virtual event series called Rethinking the Police, Activism and Reform. This is a series of deeper dives into key issues we felt demanded more attention after an initial community discussion we called Justice for George Floyd, Understanding and Responding to Minneapolis. Last week, we held a roundtable on efforts to reform and transform the police. And next Wednesday, June 24th, we will host another expert panel to discuss police abolition and what that term really means. But today, we're pausing for a moment to look beyond the role of police officers to focus on our own roles in achieving meaningful change. George Floyd's death has inspired a national reckoning with the continuing impact of police brutality and racism in our country. This discussion presents an opportunity to think about what we can do, individually and collectively, to end structural racism and the many insidious ways it plays out in policing and beyond. Today's panel will focus particularly on the next generation. We'll carry this moment and this movement for justice forward. Today, the day before we commemorate Juneteenth and the continuing struggle to ensure full equality and racial justice in America, I want to thank you all again for joining us, and thank you for the questions we have received in advance. These have helped shape today's conversation. Now, let me introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Dean Chris Henning, who led our powerful first session on justice for George Floyd. Dean Henning is an accomplished scholar in race, adolescence, and policing, and also the director of our Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. Dean Henning is a true pioneer in the search for racial justice, bringing this dimension to many critical initiatives she has spearheaded in the realm of juvenile justice. Under Dean Henning's leadership, the Juvenile Justice Initiative fights against racial bias in the juvenile justice system, has created a racial justice toolkit, and launched a new ambassadors for a racial justice program for juvenile defenders across the country in partnership with the National Juvenile Defender Center. Chris is also our Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Learning. Dean Henning, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you very much for putting together this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Dean Traynor. I am happy to be back with you. This is the third time we have come together in the days and the weeks after George Floyd was killed. In the first conversation, which we called Justice for George Floyd, which is available on video for those of you who weren't able to see it. But in that conversation, we began to talk about protest as a form of activism. And we talked about the meaning and the value of protesting. But even then, we knew that we needed to talk more broadly about activism and the many different forms of activism. And we also knew that we wanted to be in conversation with and about young people. Some of us have children of our own. Others of us work with young people as teachers, mentors, advisors, and co-activists. And we've been asking the question, so what do we say to our young people in a moment like this? And more important, how can we be in better conversation with young people about how to respond in a moment like this? So today's discussion is the beginning of that conversation for us. It is a roundtable discussion. And we will talk about the challenges and the promises of activism in all of its different forms. And we will talk about how to search for meaningful or to reach meaningful transformation and healing after the killing of George Floyd. We will look back for a moment and talk about what worked and what didn't work in historical protest and activist movements. And we will ask, why are we still grappling with so many of the same questions about racism and police brutality that we dealt with back then? And we will identify some great contemporary examples of youth activism in this moment. And then finally, we will grapple with what we recognize as a very difficult topic of healing, and healing in the midst of turmoil, Are we ready? And how do we get there? So I am very happy to be joined by a wonderful slate of panelists or roundtable participants, as it were. If all of our roundtable participants can turn on their video, that would be excellent. Great. So we have today, I'm happy to be joined by Professor Anthony Cook. Professor Cook is a law professor here at Georgetown. He is deeply committed to racial justice and community development. He serves as a national officer with the Community Development Society and spearheads a number of initiatives to build communities that are more resilient and self-sustaining. I am also very happy to be joined by Judith Brown-Dianis, a civil rights lawyer, a voting rights expert, a pioneer in the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, and currently the executive director of the Advancement Project's National Office. We are also honored to be joined by Dr. Justin Hopkins. He's a licensed clinical psychologist and diversity and inclusion counselor and speaker. He has been an extraordinary resource to us at Georgetown in a number of ways, both in a counseling function and in teaching in the classroom with us on occasion. We also have our wonderful Janae Stasier. She's a 2020 graduate of the law school. Congratulations. She is also the immediate past president of the Black Law Students Association and a racial justice advocate. And we're very happy to be in conversation with her as one of our young activists. And finally, but definitely not least, we are happy to be joined by Professor Amy Ullman, who is a lecturer in religion and professional life here at the law school. She's also a special advisor to the dean. And she is a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. So I honestly can't think of a better group of folks to be in conversation with about these hard questions that we want to dig into. I want to remind our audience that you can continue to submit questions. We received quite a few pre-submitted questions, and we are going to do our best to weave those questions into our roundtable discussion, but you can continue to submit through the Q&A. So let's dig right in. And we want to start by picking up on a thread that we started in our first conversation about 2 weeks ago. One of our panelists at that time spoke about the expressive value of protesting, meaning that the protests have value and meaning to all of us who are watching and participating. So we thought it would be great to start the conversation by turning to the youngest member in our conversation and just asking the question, so what does it mean to you, Janae? To see so many folks, not just out on 16th Street in Washington, D.C., but literally all over the country and all over the world speaking out in a moment like this?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a really surreal experience, just to summarize it. It is truly what I've been hoping for ever since the protests started after Michael Brown's murder, and the whole plight and struggle of Black Americans has really been put to the forefront in the creation of Black Lives Matter and the other movements that have started over the last 10 years. And so it is really a surreal experience, not only to be standing in Black Lives Matter Plaza looking around. That is a very emotional experience for me. I've had to answer questions from my family who are very worried about my safety whenever I go out into these protests, and explain to them that it is important for me to be a part of this because it is how I'm able to express my anger and my frustration. And when you look around, it's very uplifting to see so many people gathered together for a common cause and purpose and being so passionate in our beliefs and our views. But at the same time, it's very saddening because it's what we're asking for. We're standing in the street, sometimes in the rain. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We all have face masks on. We can barely breathe. And we're begging for the police to stop killing us and for policies and practices to be put into place or taken away just to, ask the police to stop killing us at disproportionate rates. So it's uplifting. It's also very saddening at the same time. And just seeing the impact it has had across the country, not only here in Washington, D.C., has also been very uplifting and inspiring for me. All around the world, people are recognizing that what we're doing with the policing in the United States is wrong. It's not working and it needs to change. So it has been very inspiring for me over the last 2 weeks to see how the nation and the world has responded to this.
Thank you for that. I really share the confluence of emotions that you're experiencing, the uplift and sadness and inspiration and expressive nature of being out there to express your anger. So thank you for that. I want to pick up on this notion that so many people are joining, understanding that what we're talking about here in America is important. And so many people want to join this conversation. But what we really want to do is make sure that we recognize the diversity in the ways in which we express our feelings and our solidarity around these issues. And so I want to continue with you, Janae, as you've been thinking about your own work and engaging with your family and your peers. What are some of the other different forms of activism that you have seen in this moment in solidarity with this question of racism and police brutality?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question. Because I think you're pointing out something that's really important to talk about in this conversation about activism, is that social change happens from so many different angles. It's not just protesting. It's not just the people in the streets who are organizing and making demands. There are so many different ways that we can go about this, because the way it's most effective is it happening from all different angles. And so I've been in conversation with recent law school graduates and law students who have been meeting and starting discussions about what our role is in this moment. And it's important up front that we define that there is no one role, right? We all have so many different talents, experiences, and ways to use our voices that it's important that no one feels pressure to be at the protest. If that's not the way that you demonstrate your emotions, if that's not the way that you want to show up, that's 100% fine. There are so many other ways to get involved. Just some that come to mind are donations, having difficult conversations with members of your family or friends who may not fully understand or are critical or unaware of some of the issues that the movement is arguing and making demands for. There are so many different ways that you can get involved that does not require protesting. Other ways, especially for the law students, is pro bono work and becoming a legal observer for the National Lawyers Guild, which is just a neutral person who stands out in the protests, takes notes about the happenings, but doesn't, intervene or get involved. They're there for protection of the people who are expressing their First Amendment rights. So again, there are so many different ways that no one should feel pressure to do it one way. If you are a writer and that's your talent, write about the issues, express yourself in the ways that best represent you. Again, there's no right or wrong way. The one last thing I want to add is that, especially in the legal setting, but also in many other settings, the sole existence of us is resistance. So being a Black law student in the space, in the classroom, and being present in and of itself is resisting a system that is designed for us not to be there and is in and of itself addressing racial inequality. So again, if you also don't have the capacity to do anything, your sole existence, especially for the Black students, and speaking up whenever you see injustice, that also is very, very important.
I really love that point. And, the folks who are listening are both law students, their staff, their, the general public, and being yourself, being your true authentic self in every space that you occupy is a form of resistance. As a person of color, as you say, Janae, and I really like that point. Can I ask you one last question before I engage the rest of the folks, which is you spoke about writing and using your pen as a form of activism. You have done some great writing in St. Louis, telling stories and telling narratives of folks who have been impacted by police brutality. Can you say a word about that for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my first jobs after undergrad, I worked at Arch City Defenders, which is a nonprofit in St. Louis that is is really effectively challenging systemic issues in the policing and court systems in St. Louis and St. Louis County that impact people of color and the poor. And I had an opportunity to write a book chapter with the then executive director of Arch City, Thomas Harvey, who's now at the Advancement Project. And I interviewed Black women about their experiences in St. Louis County with the prisons and the police, because after the death of Michael Brown, a lot of these issues really came to light, and it was studied on a much more critical level. So what I learned from that experience was talking to women and asking them questions allows their voices to be heard, and also allows us to understand better what it actually is like. We could look at the numbers, we can look at studies and statistics, but until you hear the stories of people who are actually living in this oppression and targeted constantly by the police and these systems, that's when it really had an impact on me. So the book we wrote is the Cambridge Handbook on Policing in the United States. And what I love about the book is that it breaks out into several different segments. Our segment, the first one, is voices from the people who are actually living it. And that was our goal, the entire chapter is the women's voices, excerpts from the interviews that I did with them. And it's important that while we do also have data and other figures, we have stories of the people who are actually living it, because that's how we best understand how they're being impacted.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. And let me give a shout out to Georgetown's Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. They are currently taking solicitations, not just from the Georgetown community, but from everyone who is listening, both on Facebook Live and on this webinar, for personal reflections and narratives, much like Janae talked about. What is your experience and reflection on this moment in the weeks after the killing of George Floyd and before then? So you can do an easy Google search and find Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. So let me pull in Anthony and have you say a bit more about the different forms of activism. Any additional thoughts that you have about other ways in which people can step up and serve, and particularly including, we've got a pre-submitted question about virtual opportunities for protesting and activism for those folks who can't get out.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Look, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the virtual space. In moments like this, the virtual space can provide a sense of community, cohesiveness, and solidarity around the kind of pain and trauma that people are experiencing, the frustration and anger that people are experiencing, and trying to constructively direct that in a way that is going to be, productive and constructive. So that, the organization that we are all familiar with, Indivisible, at indivisible.org, the movement that was, so extraordinarily instrumental in changing the tide in the 2018 midterm election. They are very, very involved in letter writing campaigns and putting pressure on public officials and organizing individuals into collaborative groups that are kind of focused on specifically identifying where the points are in the system where you can exact some leverage and create some change. And, a lot of the sociological data that came out of that movement early on in 2018 and continues to be the case is that, the groups that came together continue to stick together. Before the pandemic, they were going to Starbucks together and going to, other places together. It became like a support group, really, of folk who were engaged in that battle. I think they do that really extraordinarily well, and would suggest people get in contact with them and see if they could be a part of that. The Poor People's Movement is being revived. June 2020, this is the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And it's being spearheaded by Reverend William Barber, and it'll be held virtually on June 20th. And so you can, get to that website, june20.org. And this movement's moral agenda, is challenging poverty, systemic racism, militarism, ecological devastation. And it's mobilizing to raise the visibility of these interrelated problems. And as we try to understand what systemic oppression looks like, I think the movement is doing a great job in trying to figure out how they're interstitially connected and how we need a plan of action that is about dismantling them systematically, how race is connected to these other things. As many of you know, Dr. King was assassinated in April of 1968, and what was he doing? He was protesting and standing with sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, for better pay and working conditions. King and the SCLC were about to launch a Poor People's Campaign then. And King, during this period of time, was increasingly encouraging us to move from a kind of isolated critique of just racism and understanding what he called the triple evils that we have to deal with, and that's racism, militarism, and classism, capitalism that creates so much poverty. He said in one of his last speeches that, we're called upon to feed the 40 million beggars along Jericho's road. But at a certain point, we've got to ask the question, why does Jericho Road produce 40 million poor people? It's in need of restructuring. And that requires us to start asking very serious questions about the nature of capitalism in American society. He says, who owns the oil? Who owns the iron ore? And rather jokingly, why do we have to pay for water in a world that's 2/3 water, right? So King was about, during this period of time, really beginning to understand systemic racism and how it really operated and worked. Consequently, after the Voting Rights Act of 65 and 66, what does he do? It's not over, it's not done. We're moving to Chicago into a tenement to show how colorblind, institutionalized racism there is connected to the same kind of Jim Crow racism that we were experiencing in the South. Most people didn't go with him. And by the end of King's life, he had an approval rating of somewhere around 25%. Fully 2/3 of the American public were voting in surveys and Gallup polls that they did not approve of what he's doing. But nevertheless, he persisted. And this, I think, is part and parcel of what we have to do.
Thank you for that. Your look back at Dr. King and this discussion of the Poor People's Campaign as a resurrection of a movement that began in 1968 provides us an opportunity to at least pause for a second to ask the question, what worked back then and what didn't work, right? And to help us think about how we move forward. So, let me ask you first, Anthony, if you could say a word about, in your view, what worked and what didn't work. And then I want to pull in Judith into that conversation to help us tease that out a bit more. But let me start with you. Why are we still here? Why are we having these same conversations?
Yeah, well, excellent question, excellent question. Look, Black people are 13% of this nation's population. Massive reform, systemic reform simply does not work when Black people are the only agents and catalysts for change. If it's not a multiracial and multicultural phenomenon and movement, it's not likely to create any change. And if it does not maintain itself as a multiracial and multicultural movement, once the so-called changes have been placed, to make sure that they are enforced and operationalized and that they have the impact of redistributing income, wealth, power, and opportunity to Black people and other people who are suffering, it won't work either. So we have to recalibrate and reorient ourselves to understanding that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and requires a broad coalition who are into this intergenerationally and who will push the paradigm farther than his foot. We need to move from a system of understanding this as individual kind of bad apples in the bunch to understanding that, no, this is a bad system that is in need of correction and modification. So it's different this time in a sense. I like to feel that it's different in a sense because we're witnessing the convergence of 3 separate pandemics, the pandemics of racism and over-policing, pandemic of COVID-19, the pandemic of depression-type unemployment is creating pent-up energy, frustration, and righteous indignation and anger. It is creating the availability of people to fill the streets on a regular and consistent basis, and perhaps for a long enough period of time to be able to articulate and develop systemic solutions and demands on a system with regard to change and seeing them through. I would hope that that is the case. The public execution of George Floyd feels like the open casket of Emmett Till in many ways, right? Something that really galvanizes the attention of the American public. In some ways, it feels like Birmingham in '63, when we were nightly seeing dogs unleashed on protesters, fire hoses at full blast, crushing the ribs of Black people against brick walls, pregnant women being stumbled and beaten with batons, right? It feels like there is a moment here of reckoning, of psychological reckoning. Whether or not it turns into a prolonged commitment and engagement of the issues that can truly be transformative remains to be seen.
Yeah. I sure hope you're right, Anthony. It does feel different, but I hope you're right that it is different, and this is a moment of transformation. Judith, I'd love to bring you in as a civil rights lawyer and someone who's thought about movement lawyering. What do you say? Are we destined to repeat this over and over again, or what are the lessons we need to learn?
That's a hard question, because are we destined to repeat it? So one thing we have to know about white supremacy and racism is that as we fix the systems and structures, they readapt in ways to create the same kind of outcomes. So it means that we have to be vigilant, right? Because we can get some wins. And then the next thing we know, there's some new system or structures that are put in place that produce the same things. So vigilance is important. I think just a few things in thinking about like how this moment is different and about movement lawyering in particular is, I'm no historian. I'm just a civil rights lawyer, right? And I'm not that old to know about have been part of the civil rights movement. So all those disclaimers. But I would say this, when we started Advancement Project, the thing that we wanted to do was to lean into this idea of movement lawyering. When you actually look back at the role that lawyers played during the civil rights movement, people like Fred Gray, Constance Baker Motley, Thurgood Marshall were not just in the courts on their own, right? There was a movement that was happening and they were part of that movement. I do think that at some point, when we won a slew of civil rights laws, in some ways the movement part got taken out of the equation and we became complacent in these new laws that we were saying, okay, let's implement these things. Now, Fair Housing Act, Title VII, all of, and we started to rely on the fact that we had won. And like I said, you don't just win over white supremacy, right? White supremacy has hundreds of years of existence in this country. And so it ain't that simple, right? And so I think that the moment that we're in now, right, requires us to not only be vigilant, but as lawyers, as law students, to be connected to movement in ways that's around building power. Because if we don't have power, we can't change the rules, right? And so, for example, at Advancement Project, we always say, like, we're not the lawyers that just go out and find an organizational plaintiff to slap their name on a lawsuit. Number one, did somebody ask you to bring that lawsuit, right? Is it part of a campaign around building power? Because that's what our communities need. Are you believing in the genius of ordinary people in the way that Ella Baker thought about the genius of ordinary people? Is lawyering a tool and a strategy, but not the lead thing? And so I think we've got to be making sure that we are connected to what the people want. So like our challenge in this time is to be creative about how we get to defund, how we get to abolition. All of those things is what can we be doing with the law to do that? I want to lift up, for example, the win today in the Supreme Court. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about DACA. That is a huge win in a court that we never thought would actually rule in favor of undocumented immigrants, right? The dreamers. And so in that moment, like, let's think about the fact that there was narrative change, right? The courts don't rule in a vacuum. Courts respond to movements, not just smart lawyers, right? So there's a movement around I am an immigrant, around dreamers, that sets the context for the Supreme Court to be thinking differently about the rulings that they had to make. And by the way, in the midst of the heat in the streets, do you really want to be the Supreme Court that not only then shifts the energy, right, around what's happening to Black people, but then creates a whole lot of solidarity, right, around immigrant people. And so I think that we as lawyers have a really important role in being the back room of the movement, thinking about the strategies that moves our work forward and thinking creatively about that. And the last thing I just want to say before we move on is I also want us to like be clear about the difference between activism and organizing. We can be activists and not win a thing, because activism tends to be a momentary thing, right? And organizing is about building the power and the infrastructures that gives us the sustainable change that we need to see in this country. And so part of the challenge to those of us who are the younger folks who are in the streets, who I love and who always, young people are always the conscience of America, right? Showing us the way the Dreamers are an example of that. All the young people who we work with who are ending the school to prison pipeline, right? But the organizing piece, right? So how do you become the activist who has the long-term vision and work that's around dismantling and uprooting the power structures that have kept us in this situation of white supremacy? So I'll stop there.
That was very powerful, Judo. Thank you so much for all of those insights. And I gotta say, I think you surfaced your comments, and I think some of Anthony's comments surfaced some of the actual challenges that we are facing in this moment, the challenges of activism. You talked about the difference between activism and organization and the limits of the law at this moment, and lawyers who don't engage effectively with the folks that they seek to serve. All of those are challenges for us in this moment as activists in whatever form. I want to pick up on that thread just a little bit more, the challenges of activism, and you've broadened it for us, the challenges of activism and organization. So let me just ask, Janae, to say just a word, as a young person watching this unfold before you, what are you worried about in this moment? And then we'll open it up to others.
Yeah, I definitely think about this a lot because, like I previously mentioned, it's really exciting to see what's happening right now. But my biggest concern at this time is the momentum and how long this excitedness and readiness to activate and organize, how long it's going to last. In a previous panel, Mary Novak said that this work, the civil rights work, is long haul work. And I think that's exactly right. And it's been mentioned on this panel as well. And that's kind of what scares me is I know we are committed to seeing change long term, but it's also exhausting work. And I just wonder, and I hope that we can keep this momentum going. I've already seen, for example, the social media outrage kind of diminish over the last few weeks. And that's just an example of how in the moment when we see a murder of a Black man on camera that is so malicious, it's outrageous. But once those images are not as present and once we don't have as much to be angry about in that exact moment, that people start to fade off. So I'm worried most about momentum and keeping this movement going for as long as it needs to be, which, as has been mentioned, is going to be decades, if not hundreds of years. So.
Excellent. That's a beautiful transition, actually, to the next two questions that I want to ask. So I'm going to start with Justin, our resident psychologist among us, to talk about one of those pieces, which is the exhaustion piece that you raised, right? So I often get folks who reach out to me and they say, look, I feel bad. I feel bad that I'm not doing enough in this moment to make a difference, right? Or I can't figure out how to enter into this space and participate in this moment. I hear from my African-American friends, I'm exhausted, just as Janae said, I'm exhausted, I'm traumatized, I'm tired of having to speak out. I can't imagine, given all that I've got in front of me, how I'm gonna fit into this, to this movement in this moment right now. So I really wanna turn to you first, Justin, to talk to us about what do you have to say to folks who say any of those things?
Yeah, great, and thank you for posing that question. You know, first I would say it's okay to feel however you feel, right? To feel is to be human. It is okay to feel guilt or helpless. It's okay to feel exhausted or rage. It's simply okay to not be okay because what we're experiencing is not okay. We don't get to choose whether we feel or not, or even what we feel. We get to choose how we express our feelings, but even then, if we have to be aware enough that we're feeling something to have a choice, right? But we don't get to choose what we feel. We often do more damage actually to ourselves on our journey towards activism and healing because we're unable to grant ourselves the space to feel how we actually really do feel. Some of us may have learned or have been taught that there is no circumstance in which certain emotions are appropriate, whether that be rage or overwhelm or powerlessness. Or often we can feel ashamed for allowing our feelings to impact us, to get in the way of being productive, even momentarily, as if our external reality doesn't have any impact on our internal reality, as if we should be so robotic or impervious to our lived experience. And that's just not realistic. And quite frankly, it's not humane. So for the Black student who's questioning their exhaustion, consider the legitimacy of your body and mind being tired and what that exhaustion is actually telling you about your experience as a Black person. It's quite tiring. And to any normal, to any student, regardless of race, who may feel helpless or inept, those are considered rather normal, appropriate reactions to the abhorrent reality of racial trauma. Trauma in itself, by nature, is overwhelming. Yet it's so vital that we acknowledge and hold space for that so we don't have to forgive ourselves or grant ourselves permission to be human. And also, because our emotions are information, right? That's what emotions are. They're information about our lived experience, right? It can be hard to understand that information sometimes because our emotions can be complicated. But when we really take a pause to understand them, they can grant us valuable insight into our experience. And when we consider them, we can learn what we need in order to better care for ourselves and come to a more complete truth about our reality. And from there, become more informed about how to chart our path forward. Once we hold space for what is felt, we can then be better organized, make meaning and process what we feel, which can then allow us to mobilize with more capacity and become more productive as we advocate for change. Activism and racial justice are not simple fixes. There are not immediate short-term resolutions. Rather than deny or inhibit what we feel, we can allow ourselves to be informed and transformed by our experience. And that can better prepare us to accept the reality before us and lean into the lifelong work ahead.
Yeah, so that's perfect. It's acknowledging the trauma, acknowledging the experience, sitting in it to allow us to move forward in the long haul. And that's where I want to bring Amy in to pick up on that other thread, which you ended on, Justin, and Janae started us on the long haul, that seeing activism and organizing as a long haul. What advice do you have for us, or what are your thoughts and reflections on activism as a long-term endeavor?
So I think a lot of what I've learned in this area comes from just making the space to listen and listen to the experiences of students. I was just in a conversation yesterday with a student who's deeply committed to all of these concerns, but is trying to study for the bar. And so we talked about also how people are different in different seasons in their life. And just as Justin was saying, it's okay to feel how you feel. It's okay to work through your commitments in light of where you are in life and the season of your life. And I just really wanted to lift up and emphasize what Janae was saying earlier about the multiple ways to cultivate this kind of commitment, and also the multiple ways to reinforce the potential for power within the community. And so the kinds of structural work that we need lawyers who have passed the bar to also work on that. But I also wanted to really highlight Janae's work in bringing out the voices and the narratives, and just to highlight how difficult that is in a law school space, and that we don't always make room for the full-bodied emotional life of people as we're working through the doctrines and the cases. And so there's just a tremendous need for a kind of full-bodied examination of how do we prepare together, and how do we prepare young lawyers for the marathon, which includes a full integration of your heart and your mind and your soul, and all of the equipment that you bring as a human being to organizing, and not just the initial kind of activism, but the deep organizing that Judith was talking about.
That's great. Let's talk about the promise. You know, Amy, you picked up on some of Janae's, you know, enthusiasm, and I want to go there next. And Janae, we've already heard from you really about that you're inspired by what you're seeing, and you feel called and led to be out on the front line. So I want to turn to Judith, because this conversation that we're having today isn't just for young lawyers, it's for young people writ large. And I have been truly, being someone who's deeply engaged in juvenile justice reform or juvenile legal reform, I've been really impressed with our young people who have stepped up, not just in this moment, but really in this moment, taking advantage of, or not allowing George Floyd's death to be in vain. And so I'd love to hear from you, Judith, about what you have seen through your work at the Advancement Project about what young people are doing in this space who aren't lawyers.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So for the last, I would say 20 years, Advancement Project's 2021, we have been supporting grassroots organizations across the country in dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. And that work started before it was called the school-to-prison pipeline. And it started with suspensions and pretty quickly moved to the role that police were playing. I would say probably about 2003 is when we started to realize what kind of large role they were playing and how the federal government was putting more police in schools. And young people, and when I say young people, I'm talking about high school students, have been leading this movement to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And now a campaign that Advancement Project kind of holds with the Alliance for Educational Justice, which is the Police Free Schools campaign. So you can see hashtag Police Free Schools. Understand that this work has been developing for a long time. Like I worked with young organizers who are now adults with children and who graduated from college and all that, who have been in this work for a long time. And so part of it has been having young people speak their truths. Right? The people who are impacted and closer to the pain should be the ones leading movements, right? Because they can tell you, this is what it's like to have a cop in my school. And so they have been the truth tellers. They have been the ones videotaping the excessive use of force that's happening in our school hallways. They have been the ones saying, here's what we would want instead. So there's a young man who actually lost his life in New Orleans, George, who said, instead of metal detectors, I want mood detectors for my school, right? And so they're able to envision a different world, right? We talk about reimagining safety. Young people have a vision for what should be. And so these teenage students, high school students, have been at school board meetings. They have been turning up in the streets. We have a group we work with in Madison, Wisconsin called Freedom Inc. Those young people put police-free schools on the street, just like the BLM on the streets in DC. They put police-free schools on the street in yellow in front of the school district building. They have been really moving this work. So Minneapolis was because of young people, and those young people have pushed the teachers, right, to be on their side. In Chicago, groups like Asada's Daughters and Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, who are part of the Police Free Schools campaign, have pushed the teachers union. So the Chicago Teachers Union is on board with this idea. And so they've been really leading this movement, calling the question, having the clarity around the demands, right? And what we've been doing is helping train them up, give them the supports that they need. We pitch their stories to the media. We have a piece that I think came out yesterday in Teen Vogue about the Police Free Schools movement. And we've been connecting them across the country. because we have these things called action camps, and I'm always, I'm the elder in the room, right? And I ain't old, but like being the elder in that space, to watch the energy of young people coming together to learn and to understand, like, oh, there are other young people across the country like me, and you're giving me space for me to learn from them, to build with them, to build the future and the world that we want to see together. And so I want to say that, like, this moment, right, is actually not a moment, right? It's a flashpoint, but this movement has been in existence. And I would say, from someone who's done this work for a long time, that from the Occupy moment to the Mike Brown, Justice for Mike Brown, and Trayvon, the take over the Capitol in Florida with the Dream Defenders, which we were part of and we supported them, to the Sunrise Movement, to the March for Our Lives. This moment is really an aggregation of young people's energy and sense that there's got to be something different. And we're working for something different. We are the America that hasn't yet been seen, right? And so police-free schools so far, and you can go to www.wecametolearn.com, wecametolearn.com. That's our website with the Alliance for Educational Justice that has, like, the tools. This other thing, we've been producing these tools that young people can take and run with, right, in their own communities. But we have seen Minneapolis, police-free schools, Portland, Charlottesville, Rochester. Denver was a big one for us because we've been doing work in Denver for like 18 years with young people. And so we're going to see more of it. Young people at Chicago Public Schools, their board meeting. Oakland is next week on the 24th. The Oakland School District will vote on whether or not to have police-free schools. So, part of this is young people taking it up. Other thing is we've used social media. We've used these hashtags to be able to trend it. And then we've been doing these webinars to train newcomers up, because we also don't want people co-opting the movement, saying that it's something that it's not. And so when we're bringing on board people, we want them to understand that it is an abolition framework, that what we're working towards is actually something very different than having police in our schools every day. So, it's incredible to see the youth energy around these issues.
Hey, Chris, might I add that, look, one of the problems that we've had with regard to social movements that sometimes make them flashes in the pan, ephemeral, reabsorbed very quickly into a status quo of assimilation that in many instances not only neutralizes the gains of the past, but starts to reverse them, is that we have not thought, I think, properly about the way social movements need to be structured and how we go about organizing and structuring them over a long period of time. It's necessary, I think, that we start thinking about social movements and whatever concessions can be wrought from those movements as a bottom-up process. It's always been bottom-up, because the first Reconstruction is not possible without the abolitionist movements of the 1830s and the Civil War, of course. The second Reconstruction in the 60s is not possible without SCLC and SNCC and CORE and all the civil rights groups operating from the ground up to make those changes. What we need to add to that piece, our understanding that change in our society has most often and consistently come from a ground-up approach, is that the solutions, the recommendations, the policies, and the laws need to also be ground up. I work a lot in DC in the area of community development east of the river. And in that community, we have been engaged for a couple of years in kind of strategically and comprehensively planning what our vision for the city is. There are movements called participatory budget movements and community planning and social planning movements that are bottom up from the ground, where the residents themselves, believing in the genius of people who are in these communities, who may not have the education, the credential, or the experiences, but believing in their genius to be imaginative and creative enough to really make some very important and impactful changes to our laws and policies, is what this is about. There are three sectors that control, as it were, poor and disenfranchised, under and disinvested communities. It's the capitalist private sector, the government sector, and the charitable foundation philanthropic sector. All three of these sectors have plans and visions of what communities should be. And they develop those plans, and then they impose those plans on those communities without really their input. And when the input is achieved, is gotten, it's normally very superficial, very tangential. It needs to be just the reverse. Our communities need to be able to construct a vision and a program for change of their communities that's about community control, that is about the autonomy of those communities to be able to control funds and how those funds are allocated in the direction and future of our communities. George Floyd and all of the incidents that we're seeing are coming out of communities that have not sufficiently organized themselves to, on a long-term basis, be able to engage the powers that be that control, determine, and impact those communities. Unless we have a real sense of community autonomy and control and the allocation of tax dollars and the distribution of wealth and income to those communities so that they can control their own destiny, I think that many of these problems are simply destined to be repeated. We have lived through a history of the extraction of wealth, power, and opportunity from under and disinvested communities and the reallocation of those to wealthier communities. In DC, the white median wealth is 81 times that of Black median wealth, okay? The gulf that exists between, you know, Ward 7 and Ward 8 on the east side of the river and wards on the west side of the river is just simply breathtaking. There is a 20-year difference we have found in lifespan for those who are living in Ward 3 compared to those who are living in Ward 8, only a few miles apart. How do we institutionally recorrect this maldistribution of wealth that really is the theft of power, wealth, income, and opportunity from certain communities to build up other communities that create the disparities that we're talking about? That's not simply a police problem. It is part of the police problem, but is inextricably connected to inequalities and inequities in education, in employment, in job creation, in community wealth creation. And behind it all, in any kind of solution that is going to be lasting, has to be a conversation that picks up with the conversation that King left off with, and that is reparations, restitutional justice, and redistribution of wealth, income, and power.
So let me say this. This is, you, Anthony, and Judith have done a great job of really pulling in this theme of listening to the voices of the community, listening to the voices of the young people, and identifying solutions, and the need for structural and systemic change that ensures that communities are resilient and sustainable, as you often talk about, Anthony. And so I think that is a wonderful message to everyone who's listening today. I want to pivot. I don't even want to pivot that hard, but I want to pick up another thread of the messaging and of the themes that we want to cover, which is to our allies, right? Who ask, what can I do? Part of it is defer to the community about the solutions, right? But another part, has to be about building connection, building, enhancing communications, building meaningful relationships. So I want to turn for a second, if I can, first to Justin and then to Amy, to talk to answer what I think is another hard question is, what about those folks who aren't woke yet, right? And who aren't ready, willing to listen to the voices of the community and to the voices of the Black young folks who are making or trying to make a difference. So we got a number of questions in our pre-submitted questions, like, how do you reach the unreachable, right? How do you unlearn white supremacy? Right? So to get where we want to be, where Judith and Anthony want us to be, we got to start there. So let me ask you first, Justin, what do you say in response to that? How do we reach the unreachable? And you're on mute.
Sorry about that. There we go. Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind particularly for white allies, right, in terms of being able to listen and engage this from a space that can actually allow them to participate in the change and the movement in the way that would bring us to a place of change and real change, right, is to first do the internal work of understanding your own identity, right? If you can't understand your whiteness, you won't understand and what that means and what that does and how that operates within our society, then you cannot understand and listen to and appreciate the experience of people of color in this society. So I would say first to kind of pause and understand what whiteness is. What does it mean to be white? Recognize how whiteness operates in our society, systemically, internally, the psychological advantages, the very literal monetary advantages, and all of the benefits that it endows, and then operate from there. The other thing that comes to mind is there's a quote by James Baldwin, and I love his writing, and he once said, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And white supremacists and extreme racists spout hate, but they are not the only ones who resist dealing with the pain of racial atrocities. This is something that a lot of white people truly struggle with. And I think they struggle because when you truly begin to understand the sheer magnitude of our racial reality in this country, and how it has benefited them while brutalizing others, it really is heartbreaking. And there's immense guilt and shame. And for many, there's such immense shame and pain that they dare not tolerate or hold on to the full reality of racism for long. And in failing to do so, they are actually more prone to perpetuate racial slights, and whether actively or through complicity. So this cycle of racial trauma, awakening, more racial trauma, is in part kept intact through guilt and shame, or rather the inability to sit with those feelings, which leads to one perpetuating the trauma and the need for another awakening. This is the cyclical nature of trauma. And this, I believe, is America's cycle, right? Like we've had several moments in history where we've come to new awakening only to be re-traumatized again, right? And so there are these ways in which we kind of avoid that reality, avoid the full truth or deny it, right? Ibram Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, he once said, denial is the heartbeat of racism. And what he meant by that was that as we deny or avoid reckoning with it, we repeat it. That avoidance disrupts our healing each and every time. And we continue to rehash the same exact wound, which was never really fully acknowledged in the first place. So, as a pathway forward, I would encourage people by saying this, we would all fare better if we could detach from our narrative of our personal goodness. And what I mean by this is this: we cling to this idea that we can just be good, like we can just be a good person as a standalone quality, as if there's these categories, right, or a dichotomy, right? You got the good people over here in this box and the bad people over here in this box, right? Or in terms of race, right, there are racists and non-racists. And the truth is, right, race is a social construct. It's a part of our social fabric. It is 100% operative in every single human interaction, whether we are aware of it or not. Social constructs are defined and operationalized mostly by the majority group due to the sheer power they wield by being the majority. And so social constructs influence perception. Perception influences our decision-making. Decisions influence policy, legislature, the culture of organizations, our economy, law enforcement, community structures, right? So on and so forth. Race as a construct and racism in practice is as available as the water we drink and the air that we breathe, right? The real shame is in never truly coming to terms with what we're breathing and drinking. So we have to take inventory of our internal reactions to these atrocities. And rather than being quick to get rid of the discomfort and the pain and the shame that we feel, We have to instead be with that experience long enough to be transformed by it, and then engage the lifelong work of healing our society's ailments through real change and advocacy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Justin. I think you really helped us situate well the internal work that needs to be done before we can unlearn, before folks can unlearn, white supremacy, and before we can hear the narratives from the communities that are impacted. So I really appreciate that. Amy, I think your specialty in my conversations with you is about bridge building. Right? It's about communications, relationships, and development once we've done that personal work. So what would you offer in this conversation around engaging across these sectors and these demographics?
So first I want to kind of highlight maybe two traps. And I have found it really helpful to kind of meditate Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and specifically the indictment of superficial calls for peace, and specifically on the part of the white church. And I think there's an analogous kind of superficial call for healing that doesn't express a readiness to do this really, really hard work, and exactly what Justin was saying. I mean, to kind of go into those spaces of pain. So I think that's one trap. The second would be a kind of reactive, okay, well, what do I do? How do I fix this in the next 10 minutes? And I think I'd just like to highlight the work of Professor Rhonda McGee, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. And there she also talks about how mindful awareness can help us figure out how to respond rather than react. And so I think this question of like, how do I cultivate in myself a reflective spirit, and making time to really reflect each day, also to not be reactive in my response, but thoughtful, and pulling together all of these threads. And then the last thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and maybe just to highlight, is what are the qualities of deep friendship that can be helpful during this time? And so in my own experience also of trying to build bridges across profound difference, friends know how to wait for each other. Friends know how to make time for really deep conversations that go beyond social media interactions or tweets or even just email. Friends challenge each other with complexity and with different perspectives, and at the same time also support each other. And so I want to just travel back a second to what Janae was saying earlier of we need lots of different kinds of commitments. I think we also need lots of different rhetorical spaces. So we need protests, we need classrooms, we need family conversations around dinner tables, and we need the types of conversations that come out with friendships in order to really do the really deep work and to go into those places also of pain and of potential for deep transformation.
That's really helpful. Judith, can I invite you to pick up on that? What is it that we say, to our allies as we think about trying to bridge gaps across communities? And I think about this from the lens, you work with young Black youth. And what is it that you want allies to hear in working with young Black youth, in building relationships and building community, other than what you said earlier, which I love, which is listen and let them come up with the ideas. But even beyond that.
Yeah, so I was busy answering some of these questions.
Yes, great.
That's a good question. So, beyond listening, I think you just don't listen just to listen, right? You listen to hear and say, okay, well, what are people, what they're saying is this, right? And then being advisor, right? So like as lawyers, for example, part of our work is to be advisors, to think creatively about how we use the law to get to the point where people want. If they say we're here and we want to go here, let's brainstorm together about how we are using the tools of the law, the tools of communications, You know, and it is about like, where do you sit, right? If I'm a lawyer, I do one thing. If I'm a communications professional, right? How am I lifting up the voices and the stories and the narrative of young people to tell their own story, or Black people or immigrants, et cetera, to tell their own story. And I think, you know, I guess I keep coming back to this listen, because sometimes, you know, okay, I'm gonna say white people. So sometimes white people tend to think that Black people don't know what they need, right? And this is a moment for us, because I still get emails from people like, oh, well, you could do this. Let Black people, and I don't even want to say let, because I'm actually not asking permission around my movement and around my community, but Black people will lead in this moment, right? And it is fine to get on board, right? But to say the leadership is Black. And I've been doing this work for a minute and know that it's hard sometimes for people to say someone else is gonna lead. It's even hard within our own community, because we still have this image of a one person leader, right? I still hear people, we need an MLK. Actually, what we say about this moment is that this is a leaderful moment, right? And that the young people are doing pretty well. They move some stuff pretty quickly in a short period of time. But and we all know that it's not quickly. We know it's hundreds of years of work, right? But we're lurching forward, as Bob Moses says. So I just think that it is, whether you're an elder, whether you're a Black person who is not on the streets, whether you're a white ally, an immigrant ally, get involved, but understand that your role may be very different in this moment. And your role may be, I think as Janae said, to bring other people along, to have those tough conversations, because some of us feel like we're tired of having those conversations with white folks, right? And so there's responsibility upon white people to have conversations with their own family and friends to bring folks along, because that's some hard work that I can't do right now as I'm holding everything else.
I love that. I love that point. You know, even doing work within your own families and communities, so that I, as a Black woman, don't have to do the work for you. That's a really good point. Amy, and I know you wanted to jump back in here on that.
I think some people are struggling with feeling paralyzed. It's like, I feel like if I try to step in and reach out, I'm going to step all over everything. And so I think here this question of seeing each person as a world, and as a treasure, everybody's story is different. And so again, just to highlight the work of listening to people's stories and creating that really deep space. But I think some people are struggling with this right now. I worry about this, a little bit of a kind of paralysis. And so but to receive that invitation to be reflective rather than reactive, and certainly to think this is not it's not the moment to think you can fix everything, right? This is not a question of fixing things. It's a question of inhabiting this space of pain together and living this moment that we have an opportunity to build deeper relationships where we really have ears to hear and eyes to see, and hearts to commit also to the deeper work of justice together.
Yeah, thank you. Anthony, let me bring you in, because I think as we're coming to a close, and you see that what's happening is a lot of us are responding to this notion of, what can allies do? It's largely because of a lot of the questions that we are receiving through the feed. So I want to kick that to you. We have about 5 more minutes, and I'd love to hear from just a brief word from Anthony, Justin, and Janae about, so what word would you say to allies who are trying to figure out what to do and what to say in this moment? Anthony.
I would say that you must, first of all, make every attempt to understand yourself and to try to explain to others why this statement that really is, I think, quite bold controversial, and disruptive is true. And the statement is, your colorblindness, your race neutrality, your willingness to sit on the fence is itself part of the problem. It is itself part of the racist infrastructure that continues the perpetuation of Black subordination and the things that we've seen directed toward Black people on the streets of America. And you must choose now at this crossroads whether or not you will assimilate to the complacency of a neutrality and colorblindness where you continue to pat yourself on the back that you're not Chauvin, that you're not like those people, that I'm not a bad apple that way, and understand more, rather, your complicity in a system that creates those incidents over and over again. Those conversations that you have with people around your dinner table, in your synagogue and churches, in your employment, are conversations that I and most of us cannot have, because the truth of the matter is that we still remain an extraordinarily segregated society. If you will work to break down those barriers to push the envelope, then you will develop increasingly not only understanding, but strength and courage to challenge the more structural issues that we're talking about here. And don't get me wrong, and don't forget, the structural issues, the systemic issues must be challenged. But the reason why we live through these cycles of reform for brief periods of history that then cascade into long abysses of retrenchment and repression is because we're not doing the hard work of challenging in the spaces that we occupy the legacy and reality of white supremacy.
Powerful words. Let us end with Justin and then Janae. Janae will have the last word, but Justin, any additional comments that you want to offer up for folks who want to know, what do I do in this space?
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit. I was thinking about what Amy was sharing about folks feeling paralyzed and overwhelmed. And I would say, if you are a white ally feeling that, that's a good start. That's a mark of some empathy. You are just starting to kind of bear some of the psychological burden of our racial pain, right? We often talk about healing or change or fixing as a utopian escape, as if it's, again, a journey away from pain. And truthfully, right, healing is about change. Healing is about, and change is hard and uncomfortable. So healing is uncomfortable. It's challenging, right? It's actually a journey toward that pain and through that pain. It's a reckoning with that pain that can then propel us forward. And so it's okay to feel that paralyzed, but then allow that to inform you about just how much work there is to be done. Take care of yourself, treat yourself, do the things that you need to do to reckon with those feelings so that you can then start to moment by moment, interaction by interaction, in each and every space, be vigilant and active in confronting the structures of white supremacy and racism. And so to that, just one piece of advice I would say is I really think this movement is going to move forward by well-rested people who are in good condition and taking good care of their mental health, who can then do the long-term work. So sit with those feelings, be distressed by them. We're not journeying away from that distress. It's not about resolving your distress. It's about resolving the issue. It's okay to hold on to that distress and then process it and make meaning of it enough so then you can actually mobilize. So take care of yourself, get rest, and then move forward with your efforts.
Excellent. And Janae, let's end with you. I'd love to hear what final words, parting words of advice you have to allies or to the young Black activists like yourself. You choose.
I think I'll take the allies route and just echo the points that have largely been made in that we need you all more than ever. We can't do this without you, like Professor Cook mentioned. We are only such a small part of the population, and this is an issue that impacts the entire country, and we really need you all to step up. The other thing I want to note is that systemic racism and white supremacy and these issues that have been surfaced do not just exist in policing, they exist in literally every area of society. So if you work in healthcare, if you work in academia, no matter where you're operating, there are ways that you can call out and critique racist practices as you see them. And it is about getting uncomfortable, sitting with that discomfort, and showing up in a way that truly makes you an ally. It is hard, it's not an easy task. But it is something that we absolutely need if we're going to fight this fight together. And so that's all I wanted to add, is that you are so much needed and so much appreciated in this movement. And that's all I have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I just really want to say thank you to each and every one of you on in this roundtable. You all, from Janae to Professor Cook, to Judith Brown, Deanis, to Dr. Hopkins, to Professor Ullman, all of you have really helped me even think about my own journey in this moment. And I hope that we collectively have been able to do the same and offer some words of wisdom to the audience. For those of you who joined late or want to share this with your friends, this broadcast will be available on Facebook Live at Georgetown's Law's Facebook page. It will also be available via Twitter, and it will also be available on our YouTube page. And I think Advancement Project held a watch party, am I correct? So there are many ways that you can find it. But thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week for our fourth and final conversation around these important issues. All right, thank you.
Thank you.